there, it's Llarold, and this is my class guide for Brewmaster Monk in Shadowlands Patch 9.1. I had initially written this up for patch 9.0.5, but I've been a busy bee, and I wound up pushing it back until it really just made more sense as a patch 9.1 guide. Now, before I get into the meat of the guide, I'll start by saying that this is all based off of the Wowhead Brewmaster Monk guide, which I also wrote. So if you want a written version or maybe just some extra detail that I didn't go into in this video, you could read that guide as well, and it is linked in the pinned comment. You can also just ask a question in the comments section, and I will be doing my best to respond to everyone who has questions about the class there. Also, it's a YouTube video, so go ahead and like and subscribe. It'll make me feel good. There we go, that's out of the way. Brewmaster Monk time. The first question is arguably the least important. What changed for Brewmaster Monks in patch 9.1? And the answer is nothing. Blizzard has added some new features and content that is generally available, such as Covenant-specific Legendaries and a couple of new Conduits, stuff like that, but there's literally nothing in this patch in terms of specific Brewmaster Monk changes. Let's handle the expansion level features first, starting with Covenants. Unlike when we went over this at the end of the beta, we have a much firmer understanding of which Covenants are good and which are bad, so we can give a much more definitive answer on which Covenant you should play as a monk, and that Covenant is Kyrian. Alright, next section. Alright, fine. A little more detail. First off, the Kyrian ability, Weapons of Order, is the strongest of the 4 Monk Covenant abilities. It's not only a better burst damage cooldown than anything you can get from the others, it's also easier to use than the Necrolord or Nightfae skills, and it's way more reliable. While Nightfae could potentially deal more AoE DPS in a sustained AoE setting, if you have to move, which happens a lot in Raid, you lose a massive amount of value. Kyrian doesn't have to worry about any of that. It's just good, and it's reliable. It provides a huge mastery buff that makes it a pretty decent defensive cooldown as well. I liked Nightfae Monk a lot in theory, but really you're making a mistake if you're not playing Kyrian as a Brewmaster Monk. Additionally, Kyrian has the best signature skill for tanks, an extra health potion. Having access to another instant self-healing tool is a really good thing, and the ability to clear bleeds and curses and so on with it is really nice as well. It's just excellent. Now, as for which Soulbind you should run as a Brewmaster Monk, it's Pelagos, and this is the setup you should go with. He's a great offensive option, a great defensive option, and absolutely worth using in this configuration for basically every single thing you tank. The top half of the tree is the same as it has been all expansion, and this is the bottom of the tree, which is new and has, a couple of really good, interesting new traits that add a lot of stat budget. Technically, Forgelight Prime Mechanicos can be a DPS increase over Pelagos and raids, depending on fight length. I don't necessarily recommend him, only because he's weak defensively, he has a small knockback that can be annoying in Mythic Plus, and, whatever. Still, if you're looking to pump out more burst damage, particularly in AoE thanks to his new in-tier trait that gives a big burst of damage and cooldown reduction when you use Weapons of Order in AoE, in that case, Mechanicos, he's great. Your choices on the way there are a relatively minor offensive passive or a relatively minor defensive passive. Pick your poison based on how hard you're getting hit, but neither of the conduit options there is going to make much of a difference. And while we're on it, let's quickly cover conduits, which fit into those empty sockets in the Soulbind trees. For Brewmaster Monks, you have 4 potency conduits available, and you're going to be able to travel through potentially 3 potency conduit slots. So just to break down the options quickly, Scalding Brew is a damage increase to Keg Smash, which is your best skill, but that doesn't make it a good conduit. It's actually pretty bad due to a combination of low scaling and requiring Breath of Fire to be active in order to function. It feels wrong, but it's right. Walk with the Ox grants extra damage to invoke Nuzhao, who is one of your 2 offensive cooldowns. This conduit also takes a massive amount of time off of his cooldown, averaging anywhere from 30 seconds to more than a minute of cooldown reduction, and it is by far the best potency conduit available to Brewmaster Monks, a 10 out of 10 must-have. The Curian Potency Conduit is Strike with Clarity. It makes Weapons of Order last an extra 5 seconds and makes it grant a little bit more mastery. It's not terrific, but you should wear it as your second Potency Conduit. Just for the sake of mentioning, if you choose to play a non-Curian Covenant, the other 3 Covenant Conduits are all worth wearing ahead of Scalding Brew, but they're not superior to Walk with the Ox. I don't think they're worth more time, really. And lastly, patch 9.1 has added Adaptive Armor Fragment to all tank specs, and it's fine. A decent agility stat proc with pretty good uptime is good, but not great. For your third Potency Conduit, I think this winds up being a better all-around choice than Scalding Brew, but you know, we'll see. Let's wait for Sims to determine whether it's better offensively. It's definitely better defensively, and in either case, it's really not all that great. And that's all I have to say about that. Endurance conduits for monks are very simple. You have 2 decent options, 3 bad options, and then 1 new, very bad option, and you have 3 sockets available. Harm Denial grants you extra self-healing with Expel Harm. It doesn't affect the healing you get from your Gift of the Ox Orbs that you consume with Expel Harm, so it's not really all that big of a bonus, but it is still the best, most consistent self-healing increase available. I would recommend using it as your number 1 endurance conduit choice, but it's not like a giant gain. Celestial Effervescence is the other good endurance conduit, and it does apply to all self-healing, but only during the times when Celestial Brew is active. It's potentially more powerful than Harm Denial, and coming out of every Celestial Brew with full health is good, but a lot of this bonus will be wasted on overhealing too. Ultimately, I think this is a little weaker than Harm Denial, but it's not a huge difference. Evasive Stride deserves to be mentioned because it's a bit of a trap conduit. I think at higher ranks, it might finally start to function correctly, but I don't think we're there yet. Probably in another patch. It looks amazing on paper, turning damage into healing instead. Incredible. Unfortunately, the proc rate and the use case is so low that this bonus usually just doesn't do anything at all. Going all the way back to beta, there was a log circulating the Monk Discord for a while of someone getting, I think, 1 proc in an entire Mythic Plus run. And in raid testing, I did use this because I had a third endurance conduit, why not? And I was getting maybe like 5,000 healing in an entire 4-minute pull. Not very good. The design is appealing, but the tuning has made it virtually worthless in the first patch of the expansion, and that'll probably be true in patch 9.1 as well. Maybe it'll get buffed in a future patch, or maybe health values and conduit potency values will rise to the point that it works and it's fine. I don't know. Patch 9.1 also added Condensed Animosphere, which gives a very tiny reactive self-heal when you take damage on a 10-second cooldown. Despite the Wowhead tooltip here, the in-game value at the time of testing was 0.35% of max health. That would make it like literally 25 healing per second, which is unbelievably terrible. It could wind up being massively tuned up, which might make it useful, but with a 10-second internal cooldown, I doubt it. The other conduits available are mostly forgettable. They don't really do much at all, so don't use them. And finally, finesse conduits. Finesse conduits for Monk suck. Dizzying Tumble grants a small damage reduction debuff on enemies after your leg sweep wears off on them. Technically, it's a stronger damage reduction effect than any of the endurance conduits, and I guess it's the best finesse conduit available to Brewmaster Monks, but it's still very bad. The other finesse conduits, just, if you like one of them, go for it. The goal really is to not take finesse conduits as a monk, but if you get forced through one, just use whatever you like. Okay, next up is Legendaries, and there are only 2 pieces worth discussing here, but I will need to start by saying that the awesome domination socket system of patch 9.1 forces leather wearers to wear raid drop helms, shoulders, chests, gloves, and boots. So you will need to recraft any legendaries that go in those slots. And Brewmaster's legendaries all go in those slots, so get ready to recraft both of them and your Windwalker legendary. Can you tell how happy I am about this system? Okay, first it's Storm Stout's last keg. You should craft it in the belt slot. This is the default Brewmaster Monk legendary. It's a solid DPS increase. It's a solid defense increase. It greatly improves the value of haste by eliminating the 14% and 33% haste Kegs Smash cooldown breakpoints. It's simple, it's great, and it's what you'll use 90% of the time in raids and like 99.999% of the time in Mythic Plus. This is the king of Brewmaster legendaries, long may it reign. The only other option worth discussing is Charred Passions. You should craft this legendary in the cloak slot. It's the best option for improving your DPS in raids, and it massively changes your rotation. I'll get into more detail on that in the rotation section later on. It increases your Breath of Fire uptime, and it actually can be a decent defensive option, only slightly weaker than Storm Stout's last keg, but because of the way it changes your play style, it does actually wind up being a meaningful defensive sacrifice, and the damage gain isn't enormous. I mean, it's a couple of hundred DPS, which is worth it during farm or, you know, trying to push through a really tight enrage timer. But if you're if you're worried about staying alive at all, it's a hard-hitting progression fight, I would say stick with Storm Stout's last keg. Just for the sake of completion, I will mention that patch 9.1 has added new Covenant-specific legendaries for each class. All of the Monk ones suck. The Night Fae one is the best of them, and there's a tiny chance that in farm, Night Fae Monk using that legendary might be really good for some of the multi-target, ad fights in the upcoming raid, or maybe just really fun for doing lots of damage in Mythic Plus. But, I doubt it. You probably 99% chance Kyrian is going to stay the best Covenant for Monk, and the Kyrian one is awful. Let's move on. And let's get to the basics. This is the default talent setup. You're going to want to use this 90% of the time. There are a couple of talent swaps you can make if you prefer. The main one I would say is switching to Chi Torpedo if you like the simplicity it offers over Tiger's Lust, or switching to Summon Black Ox Statue to pick up ads, which, that can be useful as well. Some people like Black Ox Brew, although I think it's more effort for less reward. You have to use it on cooldown or you'll lose value out of it, and that's, it's a lot less reliable defensively than just running the simpler, easier option of light brewing. That's about it, but there is an alternative talent setup that's crucial for the Charred Passions playstyle, and here it is. Giant difference, right? The big change here is that Chi Wave is an important filler, and even if you're not running Charred Passions, Chi Wave can be a slight DPS increase, but it's a lot more effort, I think, for most players than it's worth. And obviously, if you fail to use it on cooldown, then it just winds up being a DPS loss compared to running Eye of the Tiger. Because Chi Wave has the same cooldown as Breath of Fire, you can use it while you're waiting for Breath of Fire to come back up if you're using Charred Passions once that damage buff is down. The only other talent of note here is Exploding Keg, which is only worth mentioning because it's a defensive bonus on the tier, and it's the only defensive bonus. So on Sire Denathrius and only on Mythic difficulty, it added a humongous amount of damage to the massive packs of ads in Phase 1. It was a decent extra chunk of damage on debuffed ads in Phase 2, and then it was a terrific defensive cooldown to mitigate some of his gigantic auto attacks that come prior to a Shattering Pain cast in Phase 3. In Sanctum of Domination, I think there's a chance it could be useful against maybe Guardian and maybe Sylvanas, although honestly, I doubt it'll get much use in the next raid. Maybe Sylvanas, that's it. Brewmasters have two very different rotations, as I've already mentioned, based on which of the two legendaries you're wearing. This is the standard rotation, which you'll want to use if you're wearing Storm Stout's last keg. If you don't have a legendary yet, let's say you're still leveling or you're on a character that just hit 60, or you main Mistweaver or Windwalker and you're still getting your legendary figured out for Brewmaster, you don't really need to change much, and ultimately it's actually simpler than this. Basically, you just Keg Smash on cooldown and then you use everything else the same way. Generally, you're going to want to start off your pulls by running in with Rushing Jadewind active, throwing out Chi Wave if you're talented into it, and then you'll pop Najao, Keg Smash once, use Weapons of Order, Keg Smash 2 more times, and then go into your regular rotation. Also, remember to Touch of Death when it's usable. There are points when using Keg Smash quickly, 2 times in a row can be worth doing, such as when you're trying to pick up threat at the start of a tough pull in a Mythic Plus dungeon, or if you're trying to quickly burst down adds in raid. As Stone Legion Generals comes to mind, you got to get that damage out before other people kill the adds. Otherwise, you're basically always just trying to keep at least one Keg Smash on cooldown, use all of your other important skills in between, and then Keg Smash when you don't really have anything else of value to use. The goal, if I had to summarize it in a single thought, is to always be doing something, but to be Tiger Palming and spinning Crane Kicking as little as you can. Now, I haven't talked about defensive skills yet, and so I guess I should. The way you use Purifying Brew is very simple. You want to use it a lot. If there's a Telegraph boss hit coming up very soon, you should probably hold on to it to purify immediately afterwards. But otherwise, you just want to try to use it pretty frequently whenever you take a little extra damage. The difference between best case and worst case Purifying Brew timing is smaller in this expansion than it has been in the past. Just chug away. As for Celestial Brew, it's sort of the same thing. There are situations in which you really do need to hold it to counter some big boss mechanic. This happens a lot in raids. There's a big boss strike. You want to Celestial Brew right as the strike's about to hit you, and then instead of getting hit for all of your health, you get hit for all of your Celestial Brew and like 5,000 health, and you're fine. Same thing happens in tyrannical Mythic Plus dungeons as well. Same exact thing. Big boss strike, Celestial Brew, it's like a 50k Celestial Brew, and the strike hits for 60k. It would have killed you, killed a lesser tank. Instead, you're at like 95% health. On Fortified Trash in Mythic Plus, or when you're tanking adds on boss fights that don't have just some big stupid strike, it tends to be more of a free-for-all. Your health drops to 35%, you chug that giant Celestial Brew shield, and now you have, instead of the 20,000 health that you were working with and your healers panicking, you have 20,000 health and then like a 45,000 absorb shield. All right, I actually think this deserves its own special section of the video. Let's go over the playstyle for Charred Passions, which is very, very different and totally DPS oriented. Again, I'm reiterating this. This is not a defensive playstyle. It's DPS focused. You shouldn't play like this for anything you're worried about dying on. So because Breath of Fire and Chi Wave have 15-second cooldowns and Charred Passions is an 8-second buff, this creates a sort of burst window playstyle. And basically it works like this. If Charred Passions is active, you still want to Keg Smash on cooldown, but otherwise you should be doing everything you can to maximize your usage of Blackout Kick and Spinning Crane Kick. Maintain Rushing Jadewind, that's important, but refreshing it instead of using a buff Spinning Crane Kick is generally a damage loss. And the same goes for using Chi Wave while the buff is active. Using Chi Wave on cooldown is great. It will help keep your DPS up, but you want to consistently use it as a filler skill once Charred Passions has fallen off. This goes for Celestial Brew too, which is why this playstyle is very scary. You want to try to pool as much energy as you can during the points when Charred Passions is down, so that you can maximize your Spinning Crane Kicks when it's active. That means using Celestial Brew as a throwaway defensive filler skill when the buff is down is a good idea. Finally, you'll notice that Tiger Palm isn't even listed here, and that's because it's basically worthless except as a defensive skill, and this is a totally offensive playstyle. You can use it if you really need the brew cooldown, but if you do, you should just be playing the normal setup instead. Spinning Crane Kick is a DPS increase even when Charred Passions isn't active because it provides cooldown on an Invoke Najao thanks to the Walk with the Ox conduit. But again, only use it without the buff if you have nothing else to use and you're pretty close to full on energy, because you really want to be pooling your energy to maximize those burning damage windows. For the starter pulls, you, as usual, want to pre-cast Rushing Jade Wind before the pull, pop Chi Wave and invoke Nizao as you move into melee range, then Keg Smash, Weapons of Order, Keg Smash again, Blackout Kick, Breath of Fire, and go from there. Alright, let's move on to stats. The basic stat priority for Brewmaster Monk is still pretty much the same as it always has been. Versatility and Critical Strike are the two most important stats. You want as much of both of them as you can get. Mastery is okay, but a little less consistent. You get a lot from your Covenant and your Pelagos tree if you're using Pelagos. And, you know, and again, it doesn't do anything against magic damage, literally at all. So that's always been a strike against it. Haste's value really fluctuates with the rest of your gear. It's decent despite the community thinking it's terrible because back in Legion it had 0 value. I don't know why the community's been stuck on that for 5 years. It hasn't been true since whatever. It's still a step below both versatility and crit, but it's not that bad. Ultimately, the most important things to go after are item level and sockets. Getting as much versatility and crit as you can is good, but secondary stats aren't all that huge of a deal. I think the difference between absolute best and worst case scenarios in terms of stat distribution is about a 10% damage difference, and that's a lot. But the real world difference between a higher item level, badly itemized piece of gear and a lower item level, well itemized piece of gear is usually like 10 DPS, 15. And at least in many cases of simming myself. So my point is, sim yourself, know that it's only going to count for damage, and item level pretty much always wins when it comes to being more tanky, and just don't worry about it too much. One other final important note is that dual wielding is basically always worth doing. You really only need one good one-hander for dual wielding to be better than using a two-hander, as much of the damage really just comes from being able to put Lightless Force onto each weapon. Tank offhand weapon damage calculations, at least for Brewmaster Monks, don't work right. And the difference in like, I think literally 60 item level in the offhand for me on my Monk is only about 30 DPS. So even if you only have one good weapon, just throw a crappy one in your offhand, put Lightless Force on it, and go for it. But again, sim yourself to be sure. As far as trinkets go, there are some decent ones from dungeons and raids, and I'll just highlight the best options. Phial of Putrefaction from Plaguefall is a simple single target DPS increase from Mythic Plus. It's totally passive and it really doesn't work very well in multi-target, but it's very nice in raid. The best defensive trinket from Mythic Plus is Blood Splattered Scale. Blood Spattered Scale? I've never been able to say the name of this trinket right. Anyways, it's from the other side, and it's probably the best defensive trinket in the entire game right now. It offers a decent chunk of AoE damage output, but really it's a huge shield, and it's terrific. I would say none of the trinkets from Tazavesh, the new mega dungeon, are all that great, but Solea's Secret Technique is a pretty decent secondary stat buff trinket. I would say it's very comparable to Stone Legion Heraldry from Stone Legion Generals. And on that note, I would say the best two options from Castle Nathria are Dreadfire Vessel from Sire to Nathrius and Stone Legion Heraldry from Stone Legion Generals. If you really need a cheat death trinket, and there are times when we all do, Splintered Heart of Alar from Sun King's Salvation is okay. It's certainly better than the cheat death trinket that's available from the new raid, but I wouldn't say it's terrific or anything. I've definitely killed people in the past with it, so I don't like that. Most of the new trinkets from the Sanctum of Domination raid are nothing all too special, but there are a couple I want to point out as being interesting. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis from the 9 isn't a huge defensive boost, but it does seem like if you're using it in, say, AoE tanking and Mythic Plus, you know, like pulling a very large pack where you're taking tons of very small hits, That could be interesting, and it could allow you to do a huge burst of AoE damage. But for tanking like raid bosses, this trinket seems like crap. Decanter of Endless Howling from Soul Rendered Dormazane is very good on paper. In testing, I found its proc chance to be lower than it seemed like it should be. So hopefully that was just bad luck on my part, or maybe a bug that gets fixed, but I would say buyer beware on this one. It's probably very good, but I was disappointed. Yeah. Reactive defensive matrix from Guardian of the first ones is also interesting, but I think you'd really need to be constantly tanking to get good value out of it. And again, it found its proc rate to be pretty underwhelming. Since Sanctum of Domination's fights are all taunt swaps, I would say this is a pretty bad trinket for raiding. In Mythic Plus, I think at a high item level, it might be pretty good just to add more shielding, but the design is kind of boring and mediocre. Weave of Warped Fates is a weird cheat death trinket. I just mentioned a Splintered Heart of Alar from Sun King. That's so much better than this. This gives you control over when you decide to come back to life, missing all of your buffs. So it's basically worthless in Mythic Plus. I guess if you have a intended designed death in Sanctum of Domination, maybe if you're using it to solo tank way during farm and you use it like a soul stone where like I'm gonna take 8 stacks of something that we're supposed to taunt swap at 2 stacks, just die to reset and then use this trinket to get back up, maybe that would be the move, but I don't think it's very good. Tormented Rack Fragment and Relic of the Frozen Waste will probably wind up getting more use than any of the other options I've already mentioned, but frankly, they're just regular, boring old direct damage trinkets. You use them, they do damage, that's it. There's nothing interesting going on there. And lastly, there are 2 more special pieces of gear I'd like to talk about. Destiny's Call is a polearm that drops off of the 9, the 3rd boss in Sanctum of Domination, and Cruciform Vein Ripper, which is a fist weapon from Soul Rendered Dormazane. Let's start with the polearm. It's a weird weapon because it doesn't have any secondary stats and it instead has a big on-use stat buff. There's some potential that you could weapon swap to this, pop it, use Weapons of Order, or really you would start a fight off with this on, pop it, use Weapons of Order, and really go wild. But I think that probably won't make up for the fact that two-handed weapons suck because you lose out on a weapon enchant, and its cooldown doesn't line up with Weapons of Order well at all. So I think it may be, if you're really trying to go for a number 1 parse, not a 99th percentile, it would be good on the pole, and then you macro weapon swap to regular dual wield setup after the 30 seconds once the buff's fallen off. Even still, I think this one's bad. Cruciform Vein Ripper is potentially better since there is basically every single fight in the tier is a taunt swap fight, and there's plenty of time you can spend behind bosses while you're not actively tanking. But I don't think it's very good either. Again, I would rather just have a normal secondary stat weapon or something that doesn't require me to not be tanking in order to proc. Yeah, I'm not sure if this one will be good or not. Oh well, I guess we'll have to see. Shadowlands has been a pretty fun expansion thus far, despite all of my complaining about it. And while Brewmasters haven't been dominant, I think they've been a very competitive tank here in the first raid tier and the first Mythic Plus season. They seem like they're in a pretty decent spot heading into the upcoming patch, and I'm really looking forward to it. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Brewmaster Monks and Shadowlands Patch 9.1, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thank you for watching. Bye.